For the next broadcast or episode of Learning with Power. And I am Scott Powers Houston, and this is going to be episode 17, and it's going to be called The Fallacies of Democracy. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, oh no, this is where I'm going to have to separate. But democracy really only works provided that the masses, the majority of people, are somewhat educated. Otherwise, what you have is what I call tyranny by the masses. And I'm going to write that on the Etch-a-Sketch here. So we have tyranny by the masses. Tyranny by the masses. That's what we have when you have unbridled, unregulated democracy. And to give you an examples of that in history and around the world, probably the best example is India. And India has a democracy. It's a full-on democracy. The UN rates it as one of the best democracies, or the truest democracies. And India is corrupt. Like, there's the worst corruption in India probably that there is anywhere. They're completely corrupt. Just to give an example, when I went to India one time, I was in Bangalore. I was working there, and they had this metro, this subway that they were building, and it was like an L, like in Chicago. It's elevated. Not a monorail, but this actual subway, or a metro. And I said, oh, when's that going to open? And they were like, who knows? I said, well, how long has the construction been like that? Because like all the roads were blocked and things, because of construction. There was this big construction area with fences around it. They said, oh, it's been like that for 10 years. And I said, how is that possible? How do you just leave it like that for 10 years? And they were like, corruption, corruption. People are paying this guy off, people are paying that person off, people are paying off that person. It's just corruption. And the reason why you have such problem with corruption in India is because basically in India, you have mass ignorance. You have, especially outside of the major cities, you've got very low level of education. And you just have ignorance. And when you have a lack of infrastructure, like they do in India, even though India is not considered to be a third or even second world country, it's considered to be pretty basically developed, but there really is a lack of infrastructure. And so the education system is just not across the board. And so you've got a lot of people that vote who are just have no idea what they're doing, and they're just following the herd mentality, following the masses. And so basically India, as a democracy, has just completely failed. The other thing is that, Germany in the 1930s actually had a democracy. They had democracy in Germany in the 1930s. They no longer had a monarchy. They were kicked out in the 1880s with Bismarck. And ever since and in the 1930s, they had a democracy that had been working for the last 50 years. And we all know what became of that democracy. Before Putin went rogue, actually in Russia, they have a democracy. They have parliament, they have a prime minister, they have a president. They're supposed to be, different roles. They have a democracy in Russia, but we see the fallacies of that. And now they have basically a dictator, and he's gone rogue. Which is causing major problems throughout the world. So another example in modern times is this thing called cancel culture. That's a good example of tyranny by the masses, because you've got basically a rumor starts to spread, somebody tried to sexually molest some boy or something, some movie star or something, and before you know it, he's out. He's blacklisted, he's done. And he may be completely innocent. You look at Trevor Bauer, for example. He was found innocent of all charges. Great pitcher, but he'll never play in the majors again just because of cancel culture. He's been canceled by our society. He's out. He's out. He's one of them. So you have tyranny by the masses. And it's not that democracy is totally bad. I mean, it's good with limitations. It's just there's flaws that need to have certain provisos to make sure it doesn't go unbridled. Because unbridled democracy is that you see the problems. And lastly, we're going to get to the United States and why democracy doesn't work and is failing and basically doesn't really exist or is ineffective in America. Okay, so the best democracy is a democracy where everybody is educated and everybody basically is aware of all of the issues. And a democracy like that worked really well in Athens. And in Athens, and the criteria in Athens was that you had to be, I think, a landowner. But still, it was a small enough group of people, few hundred, that, you know, they, amongst themselves, you know, they could discuss things and educate themselves and be abreast of the current issues. And democracy was founded by a guy named Cleisthenes in Greece. The concept or the idea, or the father of democracy, is considered Cleisthenes. And he was around 500 BC, so I mean that's almost the beginning of recorded history. The beginning of recorded history is really about 600 BC. I mean, we've got excerpts and things from the Middle East and from like thousands of years ago, like 6,000 years ago even. Samaria, things like that. But basically, it really starts around 600 BC. That's really when things start taking off, and we have civilization, more modern type civilization. Okay, so then what you have, the problem with having a direct democracy in a country like Rome, or like ancient Rome, or a country like America today, is of course logistics. And you know, in Athens it was fine. You could count, you know, 300 votes and pretty quickly and figure out, you know, what the decision was going to be. But when you have a population of 100 million or more, how do you count all those votes? And so logistically, it made it necessary for a while to have what was called a representative democracy. And so you voted for representatives, and then those representatives would vote, and then that's how that was the trickle-down way that you had democracy, and then you had a national election for maybe just like the president or something like that. And so, but for every other thing, you've got it. Basically, it's voted on by senators and congressmen in America, or parliament. And this concept, goes back to the 1200s with parliament. You know, the first idea about parliament, you know, with Magna Carta in Britain, the idea of parliament. So even at that time, even by the 1200s already, they realized that direct democracy was not practical. But now, though, today, 2024, we no longer need representative democracy. Why? Because logistically, it's no longer a problem. We've advanced enough that we've solved all the problems of logistics. Can I get your phone for a second? So now we have these things, this thing here, okay, and that's why we can have today direct democracy, because you can count the votes instantly. with those things. And everybody has one, and everybody can use it to make their little vote. And you can vote on everything. You can vote on not only the president, you can vote on issues. You can vote on whether or not Roe versus Wade should be overturned or upheld. You can vote on, directly on all this different issues and subjects that are dear to your heart, and even a lot of the subjects that have to be voted on that are not so dear to your heart, like should we build this highway going through this neighborhood, or should we rebuild this bridge, or what rights should we give contractors and things like that, or what provisions should we, what requirements should we make on certain people as far as getting a license or something like that, or even if a license should be necessary, things like that. And we can do it now directly. But of course that won't happen in America because the corporations really like the representative democracy system that we have, because they're able to corrupt that system. If we had direct democracy, corporations, would no longer be able to directly control the outcome, because individual people are a lot harder to control than a congressman or a senator. So you've got a problem with that. Another example of why democracy doesn't really work is just, even in America with the general elections. I mean, and not to pick on this particular group of people, but for example, in America, 93% of black people are Democrats. And so, obviously they're just following the herd. They're just following what the crowd is, what everybody else does. I mean, that's not, I theoretically it should be split. Since those are the two major parties, it should be split, but it's not, because they follow the crowd. And in Saudi Arabia, they report 100% Muslim. 100%. There's no dissension at all. 100% Muslim. And so they're like, well, of course, it's 100% Muslim. That's the only religion that there is, really, that matters, is Muhammad. 100%. So, and nobody dares to say anything about it. And in the most current election, you've got Biden and Trump. And those guys are winning their primaries in a landslide. You even had states like New Hampshire where Biden wasn't even on the ticket. He wasn't even included in the choices. He still wins the primary with like 48% where people actually wrote in his name. And so here was an opportunity where they could choose somebody else. They could say, you know what, Biden's a good guy and all, but geez, he's going to be 89 years old or 87 years old by the time his term is over, or at least 86 and a half. And, gosh, that might be too old. Maybe this is our chance to vote for somebody or to pick somebody who is, 60, 50, who has a better chance of, surviving or not having dementia, within this term. But no, they wrote in. They actually manually wrote in his name, just to show you. And in Trump, he had some states where he wasn't on the ballot either, and people did the same thing. They actually wrote in his name. Or they clicked none of the above candidates, or in some cases, or whatever. But, they're even winning with write-ins. And so, obviously, it's just the crowd. The herd, following the herd, must follow the leader, must follow the leader. And this is just a natural way that we are hardwired through millions of years of evolution. That's always been the best way to safety. The safest way to be was to just follow the leader and to follow the crowd, safety in numbers. And then as you're following the crowd, there was always one or two dissenters, but they would be just cast out. You're cast out. You're cast out. Anybody that has like well, maybe that's not correct. Oh, you're not following. You're cast out. And it's always been that way. The dissenters are never popular. And they're really far and few between. I mean, like 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, or, you know, very, very few dare to dissent, to really dissent. And, you know, so you have, and the ones that do become famous, like Solzhenitsyn, or Copernicus, or Galileo, or probably the best example is a guy called Bruno, Giordano Bruno. Now, even this guy on Pawn Stars, to him, Bruno is a hero. And so he spent $100,000 to buy a copy of one of the books of Bruno that he wrote in the 1500s that people had, that the church, you know, demanded that should be burned. He dissented against the church, and ultimately he was burned at the stake. You know, so dissenters, so, you know, it's not in your best interest to be a contrarian or to be a dissenter, you know. I mean, it didn't help Copernicus financially or Galileo financially, and Bruno was burned at the stake. It's a horrible way to die, for being a dissenter. And the same with me. I mean, you know, I'm not making millions of dollars as an internet influencer, you know, because I'm not talking about things that everybody wants to believe and everybody wants to hear. You know, I'm one of those dissenters, and so overall I'm not going to be popular. You know, and in America, Biden and Trump are the candidates hands down. It's not even, I mean, you know, I think Haley had like 20 delegates, something like that, 20 out of 2,000. You know, like 1%. And both Biden and Trump have overwhelming, across the board, lower than 50% approval rating. I mean, Biden's like 38% approval rating. Still wins, hands down. He's going to be the next candidate. And so we're not thinking, you know, we're just following, obviously. And in fact, in America, the whole idea that we have democracy, it's just an illusion. We have an illusion of choice. We think that we're making a choice. It's kind of like Coke and Dr. Pepper. Coke and Dr. Pepper, they don't, you know, Coca-Cola doesn't care which one you buy. Because whichever one you buy, they make money on it. You know, any Coca-Cola product, they make money on. Any, you know, Mountain Dew or Pepsi. You know, Pepsi doesn't care which one you buy. They still make their money. It's an illusion of choice. I remember when they had the yellow umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and they were complaining that China, mainland China, was imposing their government too much on Hong Kong. The promise had been two separate parties, or two separate, you know, political entities or whatever, under one umbrella. That was the promise. But China, of course, is making inroads to change all that. And so there was this big revolt about that in Hong Kong. They were called the Yellow Umbrellas. And Xi, pardon us, we had some more technical difficulties apparently. So moving on. Okay, so when the Yellow Umbrellas revolted against President Xi and the Chinese from encroaching into their democracy that they have, or that they think that they have in Hong Kong, President Xi offered them 3 choices, and they were like, no, 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 and President Xi was genuinely surprised. He was kind of shocked at their reaction to that, and he was like, well, you know, that's what they do in America, you know, and the thing is that's exactly right. That's exactly what they do in America. It's just that in America, people don't know that. They don't realize that. They don't understand that. From the outside, looking at America, it's easy to see that that's what's happening. But from inside of America, for some reason, Americans don't seem to understand that. And so, like I mentioned before, I mean, it is, you know, on university campuses, it is no longer discussed anymore what is the best form of government. They just quote people like Churchill, who say things like, well, you know, democracy may not be perfect, but it's the best thing we've ever come up with, something like that. And but it's no longer discussed on universities anymore. All they care about is worrying about day-to-day things and what's happening on their iPhone and social media. And this is absolutely intentional by corporations. It's an intentional dumbing down of the population because the corporations well understand that an uneducated populace means that they're going to just follow like lemmings. They're just going to follow. They're just going to, let's follow. The dumber they are, the more they're going to follow. And so, as far as discussing at universities, I mean, this is something that really started to pick up steam in France in around the 1820s. So, they finally got rid of Napoleon. And then they're talking about on universities, okay, so America's got their democracy, but like what really is the best form or the best system of government? Because we want to have a new system of government that really is the best. And it's from this discussions and all that Marx actually came about. And what people don't understand is that Marx was not actually against democracy. He didn't have an issue with democracy. His idea about communism was strictly socioeconomic. It's not a political ideology. It is economic ideology. There is no political ideology of communism. That's called a dictatorship. That's not and Marx did not advocate dictatorships at all. So anyway, and so this debate was going on universities, all along, in England and on campuses in the 1960s in the US, they were talking about it a lot. Even when I was at college in the 1980s, it was still being discussed, and there were still these groups of people that discussed, what was the best, form of government or whatever. And then when I came back from Asia and I kind of investigated it again in like 2019, I found that nope, they don't discuss that anymore. No discussions of that at all. Nobody's interested. Nobody cares. Nobody's interested. Democracy, America, it's the best system and it's impossible to make it any better. America's the best. Can't change it. And the only thing that anybody wants to change is actually they want to bring it back to how it was in 1787. They don't want to modify it in any way. But the problem with with America is that, first of all, lobbyism and the system that we have with lobbyists really is literally the definition of corruption. And it's kind of how you have so much corruption in India. It's just that in India, it's magnified and on a local scale. And so you can have local businessmen just paying off local, leaders or whatever. We're saying that we'll donate to your campaign or something if you approve of our contract or whatever, or us getting the contract. And so, like the problem with the monorail or the subway in Bangalore is that there's competing companies that want the contract, and they can't settle who should get it because they're all paying money under the table to try to get the contract. And so you've got this quagmire, can't move anymore. And you kind of have that in America too. Also, you've got a problem in America with the representative democracy. And so anyway, to go back to lobbyism is literally pay for legislation. So you have politicians that, like for Halliburton or whatever. And they'll say, okay, you give me money for my campaign, and I will, support the Iraq war and make Halliburton billions of dollars. And then, and we're talking about Cheney, and then after I retire, I'm going to go to work for you with a salary of $1 million a year, which is after his presidency, which is not illegal during the time that he's president, but it's still an agreement that they make. And it's basically Halliburton paying for legislation. I mean, it is directly corrupt. It is the literal definition of corruption, and that's how American politics works. Also, like I was going to say about the representative democracy, senators and congressmen. And so you've got senators and congressmen, and the problem with that is that a lot of the things that they vote on, the practical, logistical things that they vote on like infrastructure and things like that, are things that they know nothing about. And now they have people that work for them, and they have these committees to try to do research, but not every congressman or senator is actually very responsible about that. And yet they vote, and their vote counts, and their vote represents thousands of Americans. And they don't know what they're doing, and then they get reelected year after year after year because of the name recognition. Because that's all people want. People just want simple black or white. And so name recognition is really important. And so they wind up being senator or congressman for like 40 years. And they're not abreast with the issues, they're not up to date at all, and they're just winning and winning and winning because of the name recognition carrying on every year. And so, and now we have cancel culture with the internet and all this stuff, and I mean, there's a lot of things about America, even socially. Clearly, the culture is broken. And I know people are always like, oh, the end times are coming. I'm not saying any kind of thing about the end times, but the culture is broken. And the corporations are intentionally dumbing people down. And people are just buying into it. And everything that happens now, politically, it just furthers the corporate agendas. And so you have all these things like I've mentioned before about no-fault states having mandatory insurance. Things like that. I mean, none of these things are for the people. Corporations won, right? They won. Okay, so what's better? Well, believe it or not, the best form of government is a benevolent dictator. Actually, that is the best, most effective form of government, and that throughout history, and even in modern times today, but throughout history, that has repeatedly been the best, most effective time so the most prosperous times in any country's history is when they had a benevolent dictator who was trying to be a good leader. He liked the people, he was for the people, and he seriously endeavored to try to do the best job that he could do. Unfortunately, that didn't happen very many times, and the systems that they had for electing or for figuring out who that person was going to be were completely flawed. And we have a modern version, actually, that's happening today of an example of the advantages of having a benevolent dictator, and that is the Sultan of Brunei. And the Sultan of Brunei is still the Sultan. He's been the Sultan since, I think, 1967. Brunei is on the island of Borneo, and it's a country that's where people have the highest standard of living in the world. And I mean, they have social services and fantastic public transport and free college, free education all the way through college. And everybody there is educated and gets good jobs, and it's great. And it's because they have a dictator or a sultan, which is the monarchy, who really cares, apparently. I mean, he's got his own collection of sports cars, you know, that's pretty opulent, but other than that, he allows the money to be spread around pretty evenly. And people allow him his sports car collection because that's his only vice. Otherwise, he's very, very benevolent. And so, and it works really well. I mean, he's got lateral authority on all broad subjects, and it works. And the best example that we had of that in America was Roosevelt. He was a president for 4 terms, and we got the most positive things done in our country during his presidency than we ever had. And that was the closest that we've ever had to a dictatorship in America. Okay, the problems, though, with the dictatorship are obvious, though. And that is, what if he goes rogue? What if he's bad? Or what if you have a bad dictator, like Phocas in the Byzantine times, or in the early 600s? Or what if you have a guy that overthrows the democracy and essentially becomes a dictator, like Hitler or Putin? What happens if that happens? You know, so how do you come up with a system whereby you determine who is going to be the next benevolent dictator? And So what you really need to have, what's really important to have, is you need to have a very effective system for a recall. So if for some reason, like Putin, who was a great leader for a while, but now he's gone rogue, you need to have a system in place whereby the people can recall him. And that's that's the problem in Russia. They don't have that. That was the problem in Germany. They didn't have that. And so it took a World War II in order to get rid of them. Another problem with democracy, basically, and that is just people just following. To give you an example, there is a book or a short story written by Kurt Vonnegut called Harrison Bergeron. And basically, Harrison Bergeron was, he was the fastest, most intelligent, best looking, tallest, best built, whatever, superior person. And he had, but in order for everybody to be equal, in order for all people to be equal, you have to have, everything has to be based on the lowest common denominator. So if you have the majority of people voting and deciding what we're going to have, you have the dumbest things that emerge, even in the marketplace. You have the dumbest things that could possibly, because they have the lowest common denominator. So the only way to make Harrison Bergeron equal was he had these weights weighting him down so he couldn't run so fast, and every time he had an intelligent thought, he had a sharp, thing that happened in his brain because he had these brain-like probes on his head and stuff, and so that kept him from thinking smart things, and he was like made to look not as attractive or something. I mean, all these, he had all these limitations because he was not equal. He was better than equal. So that's a short story by Kurt Vonnegut. Harrison Bergeron. I love to quote him. Okay, so and one thing that you have to do is you have to keep out religion, and you have to keep out the influence of business. And both of those things are very natural to be involved with politics. I mean, you almost cannot have a political system in the Middle East without involving religion in some way. And business is just natural. I mean, I remember there was a friend of mine named Agar in Mongolia, very successful, very influential businessman, and he was like, I never wanted to be a politician, I never wanted to get into politics, I never cared about politics, but I'm finding that in order to further his corporate agenda, that we have to become politicians, that we have to get involved in politics. It's not something that I even want to do or even have an interest in, but I have to just for business reasons. And so this is something that we need to keep out. We need to keep that separate from politics. When business gets involved in politics, or politics is about religion, then you do not have the best interests of the people being served anymore. You have pork bellies. You have smaller interest groups now are being represented more than the populace. Okay, so if you look at history, or you look throughout history, one of the problems with democracy or democratic systems, and it's something that we're having a problem with right now, is that every time throughout history, big problems, major problems happen whenever you have a leap forward with the dissemination of information to the masses. So whenever the dissemination of information becomes easier on a mass scale, that's when major upheaval happens. And so to start it off, you have like the Roman Empire. And so the whole idea of we want a savior and all this kind of stuff. That happened during the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire finally had enough infrastructure and roads that connected all the different areas. I mean, it connected Turkey all the way to England, basically, with roads. And so they had this great infrastructure that they created. And because of that infrastructure, now you had to run or use a chariot or something in order to get across these roads. But you still had much more ability now to disseminate information amongst a much larger group of people than you ever had before, and so you have massive upheaval, massive protests, massive, and so that's where the whole Christian movement came from, and it ultimately resulted in the fall of Rome. Okay, the next major innovation that happened, and a lot of people may make a lot of other arguments, but really the next major thing that happened as far as disseminating information to the masses was the printing press. Now they had printing and writing and things like that before, but the printing press, now you could go and within an hour you could have 600 copies of something. That dramatically influenced the mass dissemination of information amongst people. And soon thereafter, what do you have? You have the Protestant Revolution. You have Martin Luther posting his points on the church, and people are printing pamphlets and they're printing what those points are, and it's being spread all throughout the empire, and you have a major problem, and eventually it turns into what was called the Protestant Revolution. It's like the next major upheaval that happened, and so that was in the early 1500s. And then the next major thing that happened was radio, and that happened in the 1920s, and that really is how Hitler came to be, is because of radio. And it was just inevitable that eventually there was going to be somebody like that would emerge from around that time. And of course it took him a while to get his following going and things like that, but radio is what influenced his rise. And now it's happening once again. And the next massive advancement in terms of mass dissemination of information to the people is the internet, like with what I'm doing right here. And that is causing a problem today. It's causing a big problem. And there's a lot of problems that are arising as a result of this. And we don't know what the end result is going to be, but there's going to be some kind of upheaval eventually. So the problems with democracy, like I said, is what if it's it needs to be restricted, because otherwise people just want to parrot out narratives. They hear these narratives, it sounds good, and they just want to parrot out these narratives, and they just follow. They just follow. And they don't even realize that they're following. They think that they've made a choice, but they're not. They're just following, and all they're doing is they're just following their leader of choice, or my God's better than your God, my leader's better than your leader. I'm in America, we have like 2 political choices. But they're just parroting out narratives. Nobody's actually thinking about anything independently. So what you need to have is you need to have voting be restricted, or else it's not going to be effective. If you just allow the masses, like in India, to just vote, then the masses are easily manipulated, very easily, with media especially, and with the internet now. But the problem is that And we've attempted to restrict democracy in the past, but with all the wrong reasons. We've tried to restrict it even in ancient Greece. It was restricted by you had to be a landowner. It shouldn't be restricted by landowner or education or religion you are, or what party affiliation you are, or whether or not you're an ex-con, or what race you are, black, white, Indian, whatever, what sex, man, woman, whether you're gay or straight or whatever you are. None of those things matter. And none of those things should matter. And none of those things should be allowed to matter. The only thing that should matter is whether or not the person themselves individually has an understanding of what's at stake. And they don't have to be experts. They don't have to have a super high IQ. They just have to be aware of the issues and what's happening. They have to have enough of a background of knowledge to prove that they have a legitimate vote. And they can vote one way or the other, it doesn't matter. Whatever it goes in that case, you have to accept, because that's what wins. But somebody's got to win, But as long as the people vote responsibly, and as long as they have a reasonable understanding of what they're doing, then it can work. But how do you restrict that? Well, maybe by testing is an example. But then how do you do that? There's psychological tests that are made and things like that. And there's ways to do it. But of course, it's all going to be controversial. We'll talk about all that later. So So I'm moving along here. So like I said, so we have an illusion of, so I talk about them, okay, and so we have an illusion. Okay, and so let's go back to Hitler for a second, and so even if there was an election, a democratic election in 1940, just like we have in America today in 2024, if there was a democratic election in 1940, Hitler would win by a landslide. He would still win by a landslide. When you look at all the videos of Hitler, you see everybody going, "Sieg Heil!" And you've got like one person is like circled as being like the one guy going, it's like one person in the entire crowd is not doing this. So he would win by a landslide. And that is the fallacy of democracy. That's it. And so, like with Hitler in 1940, and so it is today, in 2024, we have tyranny by the masses. And that's the fallacy of democracy. That's what illusion of choice, we talked about that, okay. So I think that pretty much gets me, that starts to get me up to what I'm going to talk about next. And what I'm going to talk about in my next episode, in episode 18, is I'm going to talk about the solution. You know, what's the best? And several years, or maybe 10 years ago, I was asked to come up with what's called a plan for Hazarajat, which was going to be a new nation created within Afghanistan, called Hazarajat. And we came up with a plan for how you could successfully overthrow the powers that be, basically the Taliban. And he said the people want a secular government. We're tired of this Muslim stuff. We don't care. You know, it's okay if you're Muslim. We don't care what religion you are. We want a secular government. And the people in Afghanistan really do want a secular government, but they're not being allowed to have a secular government because the Taliban doesn't allow them to have that. And so he had this plan for like overthrowing the Taliban, and he asked me to come up with what then should be the best government, because there's been a lot of revolutions in history. You know, you look at 1959, Castro in Cuba, very successful revolution. The problem is oh my gosh, we won. Now what? You know, and they always screw up the end game. You know, the end game is always screwed up. They never have a plan for what they're going to do if they win. So he asked me to come up with a plan for what would we do if we won. And so he asked me to come up with a political structure and an economic, socioeconomic structure that was secular, that would be the most effective by today's standards. And I came up with that, and the plan is called the Hazarajat plan. But we have to find it. It's on my computer somewhere buried. We just have to find that. Again, the logistical, technical problems. I think we'll find it, though. I think it's on there somewhere. And so that will be the next episode as soon as we find that. And so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, please like, share, subscribe to Learning with Power. I'm Scott Powers Houston, and we'll see you next time. Have a good day.